Thank you all for being here and welcome to AJC Scholars and Statements series. Should it be statespeople? Before we begin the program, I'd like to thank the Marshall Society Scholars and Statesmen Planning Committee members for their vision and leadership in creating tonight's program. Doris Himes, Ira Handelman, Shelley Rivlin, and Sheila Wasserman. So let's give them a word. I am Rabbi Gary Greenebaum, and I am once again your interim director. Tonight's program is going to be very exciting for all of you. If you've not had the opportunity to interact with Deidre Berger and to hear her, it's going to be a wonderful night. And we are all really anticipating her talk and her conversation tonight. And tonight in particular is an in-depth dialogue between Deidre Berger and LA's own David Suissa. We will then follow with questions and answers from the audience. So without further ado, I'm honored to call upon Lee Raymer, who heads or founded the Lawrence and Lee Raymer Institute for German-Jewish Relations 20 years ago? Almost 20 years ago? I can't believe it. It's unbelievable. And she will introduce our speakers this evening. So I want to welcome Lee. Thank you.
So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to what? Too close. Welcome to AJC's Marshall Society evening. I am Lee Raymer, and I have proudly supported AJC for many years. When my husband Larry and I helped to establish the Raymer Institute for German-Jewish Relations, which ensured a permanent presence in Berlin for AJC's incredible work in global Jewish advocacy, we felt we were given an exceptional opportunity, really, to make a difference in an area that was very important to both of us, which was transatlanticism and the future of Jews in Europe. I am so glad that we took that opportunity when it was offered to us. Tonight, we will hear from two major voices of Jewish life, one from in Los Angeles, as you just heard, and the other from across the Atlantic in the heart of Europe. With anti-Semitism surging on the streets of Europe, as well as on our own campuses right here in Southern California, our conversation today is unfortunately very timely and very important. I am honored. Am I too close still? I'm honored to introduce David Suissa, who is president of Tribe Media Corporation, which owns the Jewish Journal, Tribe Magazine, the Hollywood Journal, and the news site jewishjournal.com. For the past 8 years, he's been writing a popular weekly column in the Jewish Journal that earned him the, quote, Best Columnist Award by the LA Press Club. Formerly, David was founder and CEO of Suissa Miller Advertising, a marketing firm that was named Agency of the Year by USA Today. Among his community awards, David was named one of the top 50 Jewish leaders in North America by the Forward newspaper. David was born in Casablanca, was raised in Canada, and has been living in LA since 1982. I'm honored also to introduce Deidre Berger, my friend, who since 2000 has served as the director of AJC's Berlin's Raymer Institute. In that capacity, she advocates for a strong transatlantic partnership with representatives of governmental and non-governmental organizations. She works closely with German and European partners on issues including European security issues, Mideast affairs, anti-Semitism and extremism, and the promotion of democracy and human rights. And I have seen firsthand how much she is respected and truly liked by the members of the German government and others that she works with. Prior to joining AJC, Deidre worked as a German-based foreign correspondent reporting for National Public Radio, NPR, the Deutsche Welle, the Voice of Germany, an international television and radio network that I think we get here, and leading newspapers in the US and Germany. So to begin, here is Deidre Berger.
Thank you so much, Lee. Am I on? Yeah. Am I wired? Okay. There's still some seats here for anybody who's standing, because please feel free to come. Let me return the compliment to Lee, because without Lee and her late husband Larry, we wouldn't be doing our work that we're doing today in the way that we're doing it. We had the they had the vision that helped us perform something that has been part of AJC's DNA from the beginning. Because there's some people here who are a little newer, let me just explain that AJC was founded in 1906 following a series of pogroms in Kishinev, then Russia, today Moldova. And there was a feeling among prominent American Jews that it was time to come together to work to help lobby the American government to do more to protect Jewish security around the world and to build the relationships worldwide that were necessary, that when there was trouble, that we had the people to whom we could go to intervene to try and help and aid Jewish security and welfare. AJC has remained true to this mission for more than a century. And indeed, that's what we continue to do today, to build those essential relationships worldwide. We have a global network so that we are there when something happens. And as we know, in the last year in particular, a lot has been happening on the ground in Europe. And we have been particularly well positioned. We have offices in Berlin, I'll talk more about in a moment, in Brussels, in Paris, a representative in Rome, and a major office in Israel. Many of you have been to Israel with one of our missions or groups. And in addition, we have close working relationships with Jewish communities throughout Europe, even including the European Union of Jewish Students. It's important to us to use those relationships and work together and come together at this time when there's a strong feeling that Jewish life is threatened in Europe. This is not a time for alarmism. This is not the 1930s. These are not governments propagating anti-Semitic measures, but there is a very heightened feeling of danger for good reason in the wake of Toulouse, Burgos, Brussels, Paris, Copenhagen. It's a lot of Jews who have been murdered due to anti-Semitism, and that says nothing of the thousands of incidents of anti-Semitism and many dozens of others where Jews have been physically assaulted in past years. We have a major problem, and AJC works to confront it. We're in Berlin, in particular, coming back to the vision to starting the Raymer Institute, because today Germany is the key country for us in Europe. Let's make no mistake about it. For transatlantic security, we need to work and partner together with Germany. It's the most populous country in Europe. It's the economically most important country, and it's rapidly, again, acquiring tremendous political importance. Whatever one may think, and it's understandable to have some reserve about the reemergence of Germany, it is our key partner. And that's why it was so important 20 years ago to have the vision to open an office in Berlin, because being on the ground, we do have a different impact and a different outreach than if you just visit a country from time to time. Those visits are also important. We continue to have delegations visiting Germany, France, England, Spain, Italy, many countries, because we have close ties with European leaders. But essential is the daily work that we do in Berlin, in Paris, in Brussels, working to discuss issues of anti-Semitism, of the promotion of democracy and tolerance, of ways to better integrate the minorities in Europe, in particular Muslim minorities, issues of Israel, issues of terrorism, ways to fight counterterrorism, those issues that are up front on our agenda, issues of Iran, how to deal as Europe with issues. And it's important for us to help make Europeans understand that this is not us as Americans or as American Jews coming and telling them what's important. This is in their own interest. This is a dialogue. And key to a dialogue and key to what AJC does is to convince others to engage in dialogue with us. We also learn from it. It's not a one-way street. There's a lot to understand about different perspectives in Europe, how they approach issues, but there's a lot that they also can understand from our perspective, which is that Jewish life is essential not just because we're concerned about the security of the Jewish people, but because Europe today will be a very different continent if Jewish life starts shrinking because people are leaving due to anti-Semitism. This is European post-World War II democracy at stake. They're very high stakes. That's why we at AJC have been working hard in the last years and months and weeks to alert European Jewish leaders, not just to the problem, but to get them to start taking action. We're very pleased, for instance, in France, in the last few weeks, they've just appointed a commissioner to deal with, to fight anti-Semitism and racism. We did a lot to advocate for this position. There's an interparliamentary group being formed in France within the parliament to deal with these issues. In Berlin, we work with members of parliament. We convene them to come together across the parties. There's 4 parties in parliament to discuss the issues, to help them advocate for more money, more funding. In Europe, there's a lot of civil society is funded by government. We've been successful. They have allotted more money. But long term, how can we confront this rise in anti-Semitism? Where is it coming from? And I'm very pleased that we're going to discuss these issues now. Let me just say one more thing about the Berlin office. Not only do we have numerous delegations visiting us, some from Access, which is our young professionals organization, some from AJC, from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, a long-term partner of ours, and we have a number of alumni of this program. I see lots of heads nodding. Any head you see nodding is someone who's been on this program. But in addition, we are working tirelessly with members of government, members of parliament and their staffers, with members of media, with the think tanks, to promote those issues that are really of concern and interest to us in the American Jewish community, and to strengthen the American-German-Israeli relationship. It's a critical relationship, and let's make no mistake about it. If Israel loses Germany and Europe, it's going to be in a much weaker place in terms of its security. This is essential. Attitudes toward Israel in Europe are not what they are in the US. It's a whole other discussion. They're at stake. We do what we can to bring in other perspectives in Israel, more and more to bring American speakers, Israeli speakers, to bring different elements to the debate that might be there if we weren't there and present on the ground. And for us, in particular, the German-Israeli relationship, which this year, it's 50 years of the diplomatic relationship, is a key part of our understanding of global security in coming years and decades. We work to advocate for that relationship, for a Europe that is somewhat freer of a prejudice than is perhaps the case today, and to work with Europeans as partners on a global scale. And I think this is also a key part of what AJC does that distinguishes us. We're working in partnership because we're much stronger that way. We have a strong voice, and when we can work together with others, we learn from it and everyone benefits. And I think this is part of the agenda that's made AJC very strong at this moment in time. We're going to convene a conference on May 4th and 5th in Brussels on anti-Semitism. We're bringing together government leaders from key European countries from within the European Parliament bureaucracy. And these are one of the many ways that we come not to criticize, not to moralize, not to lecture, but to say, let's sit down together and find out what we can do. And I look forward to talking about that. Oh, David, thank you.
Can you hear me? I don't need a mic. You know, only Jews love to get together just to hear bad news.
I wasn't alarmist enough.
David, actually, we can't. Yeah, it's hard to hear, and we're trying to pick it up on camera.
Can you hear me?
No.
Can you hear me now? Okay, good. I'll move it up. I was born with a mic, so it should be
Higher.
a little higher. How's this? Better? Okay. So let's start. We're very worried here. You know, we obviously because it's Germany, it's extra worry.
Yeah.
So one of the maybe it's because of the subject.
Has us on edge.
One of the first things I'd like to know is how is the anti-Semitism in Germany different than the one we hear, for example, in France?
It's an important question. It's a very different quality. There is plenty of anti-Semitism, I'm afraid, in Germany, as we saw this summer with demonstrations on the streets, not just of cities throughout France and the UK, but also in Germany. There's a different Muslim population in Germany, and this is very important to understand. In each of the European countries, the composition of the Muslim population is different. In Germany, 2/3 of the 4.4 million Muslims are of Turkish heritage. Unfortunately, since President Erdogan has become more and more openly anti-Semitic, it's had some impact in Germany as well. Nonetheless, this has not been a country where there was traditionally the degree or level of anti-Semitism as in parts of the Arab world. And there's traditionally been less tension between the Jewish community, for instance, in Germany, and the Muslim community. It's changing somewhat, but it's nothing comparable to the situation in France or the UK. I think there's also a difference because the ways in the type of integration has been different. Most of these Muslim communities in all these countries came after World War II. There's no history of colonialism in Germany. People came voluntarily, not because they were fleeing a war, as in France. It means that it's simply a different quality, and that the level of integration in Germany is also different because we don't have the issue of these banlieues, the virtual ghettos outside of Paris that have unfortunately become real centers of problems.
And how much of the anti-Semitism comes from the radical Muslim, if you will, and then the far right and even the far left? How much is it Muslim-driven?
In terms of the potential for violence, it's very Muslim-driven, and it's a reality that's not reflected in government statistics. We're upset about it, and we're upset that people aren't willing to say it. It doesn't mean that all Muslims are anti-Semitic, and nonetheless, it is the reality.
And it's politically incorrect to say it.
It's politically very incorrect to
say it. I had a Catholic priest at my house one Friday night, and he just told me, the situation in France is very, very much Muslim-driven. The situation, the anti-Semitism in France, is very much Muslim-driven. And I was asking if...
Father Patrick Dubois?
Yeah.
Yeah. We work with him closely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a similar thing in Germany. And how much are the Muslim communities being radicalized in Germany?
They are being radicalized, and it's a real problem. I think, just to go back 1 second, the more violent incidents of anti-Semitism are coming largely from the Muslim community. Most of the anti-Semitism is not at the level of violence, however. There's plenty of anti-Semitism coming from the left with its with certain conspiracy theories about what the Jews do and how the Jews drive capital and the Jews own the media, etc. There's plenty of anti-Semitism on the far right. It's an integral part, as we know, of right-wing ideology, and some plain old anti-Semitic stereotypes that are still very prevalent in the middle of society. Just to make it clear, there's a particular problem there, but it's not just there. In terms of the radicalization, we're very concerned about the jihadism, the number of young Europeans going to fight in Syria, thousands and thousands. Germany alone, there's more than 600 young Germans who are now in Syria, most of them Muslim, but more and more converts. This is another alarming problem. They are being radicalized. The problem is it doesn't take years anymore for recruiters to radicalize these young people. They're being self-radicalized through internet and social media in a matter of weeks. And the intelligence, Secret Service authorities are highly alarmed at this development.
Wow, it's pretty scary. Now, in terms of the fact that so many Israelis have moved to Germany in the past few years, there was even a movie written up in the LA Times today on an apartment in Berlin, just sort of fascinating story. How has that influenced, if at all, the anti-Semitism? Has it made it worse, better, or indifferent?
I don't think it's had any real impact. It seems like a big deal because for us, the emotionality, the idea of Israelis on purpose going to Berlin, it's an upsetting idea for many in Israel, I know. But the problems of anti-Semitism, have existed for quite some time. They're very deeply rooted. And I think the real issue is to what degree does the Israel-Palestinian conflict have an impact on anti-Semitism? Whether there's real Israelis there or not. As we know, anti-Semitism doesn't need Jews, and anti-Semitism related to the conflict doesn't need Israelis. A great deal of the anti-Semitism at the moment is being, I think, grafted onto this idea of it's the conflict. It's not really anti-Semitism. It's an excuse. But for us, it's just a convenient excuse. I was at many rallies. In Berlin this summer alone, we had more than 50 anti-Israel demonstrations. More than 50. And I have to say, this is a new phenomenon going back to social media, which I just said with the radicalization. Social media has allowed, instead of just planning for weeks for a demonstration, it's possible now inside of hours to get hundreds of people to come together at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. And this is what happened constantly. So we saw this being used as an excuse, and all of the demonstrations I was at, there were expressions of anti-Semitism. What I consider anti-Semitism is Israel as child murderers. Yes, that's an anti-Semitic stereotype for me because it plays on blood analogies, on this idea of Jews eating children, goes back to Passover. I mean, there's all sorts of stereotypes involved. There was one rally, I was at a pro-Israel rally, and about a mile away there was a counter demonstration of Palestinians that formed quickly. Again, through social media, the police were somewhat surprised by it, but eventually they went over to them. And these young men were shouting at the top of their lungs. Some of you are German speakers. I'll say it first in German. Jude, Jude, feige Schwein, komm heraus und kämpft allein. It means Jews, Jews, cowardly swine, come on out and fight alone. Does this sound anti-Semitic? So what did the state prosecutor say after AJC filed charges? Well, it fulfills the criteria of insult, but not of incitement. So as a result, they said, okay, the demonstrators can't use it because it's an insult. 2 days later, I was with my staff at another one of these rallies, and what did the demonstrators do? They started shouting, Zionists, Zionists, cowardly swine. So the interchangeability of Jews, I mean, what
They're
more do
very
I need
clever.
to say?
They're very clever.
Yeah.
I mean, Israel is the Jewish state, so it's a very clever technique. Now,
Yeah.
are you referring to Muslims now?
Not only. There were largely Muslim demonstrators, but not only. There were people from the left and right-wing radicals there. There was everyone.
To what extent does this sort of evil expression that you see influencing the rest of the population, if it's possible to measure in any way, because that's really the threat. There's always going to be extremists, but the question is, can they contaminate sort of large masses of people and get a critical mass of hatred like they're trying to do here on U.S. campuses?
We're concerned about that. We think that after this series of rallies this summer, that it kind of loosened some inhibitions about anti-Semitism. We're concerned that certain things feel more open. Kids at schools are feeling it. We're getting lots of reports. You know, it's not easy with anti-Semitism. It is a lot anecdotal. A lot doesn't get reported. In Germany in particular, Jews don't like to go to the police to report these things. And we talk about it within the community. But we feel like certain inhibitions have simply been lifted. And these are all little mosaic stones, so to speak, in a larger picture.
Yeah. I think what makes it really complicated is that even when they don't use a anti-Semitic version of anti-Zionism like you were referring to with babies and so forth, I think in terms of just plain communication, the mere fact of the Israel hatred and just putting down Israel, knowing that there hasn't been any demonstrations against the 200,000 being murdered in Syria, and when you see that there's such a focus on anti-Israelism, that I think it's just going to sort of reflect negatively on all Jews, whether they're specifically anti-Semitic or not. Just the incredible focus on Israel. How do you deal with that?
We're trying to raise the issue in public to get the German government and also European governments to start distinguishing between this, to not hold Jews collectively culpable for the acts of the State of Israel.
Right. No, but what I'm saying something different. I'm saying the obsession with Israel itself.
Okay.
The obsession which we've seen at the United Nations, we see it on U.S. campuses, we see it throughout the world.
Yeah.
There's a pathological, unreasonable, irrational obsession with Israel. And I don't care what words they use, it's going to sort of infiltrate and contaminate just, you know, the issue of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
I mean, is there, and I'm not saying there's anything you can do on that, but is there? I'll give you some good news.
Give you some good news. Well, I don't know if it's good news, but something that we found helpful. There's a German-Israeli school book commission that's currently looking at, in both countries, the textbooks to see what it says about the other country. And these are academics who are searching through hundreds of textbooks. The not good news is that they found, for me not unexpectedly, in German textbooks, they've determined that there is a very one-sided picture of Israel that's emerging. The good news is that when they come out with these official findings later this year, that this will force textbook companies in Germany, I hope, to start revising the image of Israel they're presenting. They're one-sided because almost everything has to do with the conflict. There's very little information about Israel outside of the conflict. So I think it's ways like that that can start making a profound difference in the way people view Israel. I think there's also ways to get public opinion leaders to think differently. We at AJC have programs like Project Interchange, which are exposure trips to Israel. We bring hundreds of opinion leaders to Israel every year from the U.S., from different European countries, and thank you to there are lots of people here who support Project Interchange. But we can't bring everyone to Israel, so we need to find ways to have an impact. I think the education system is really key, and to educate teachers. And we at AJC Berlin are working with the Berlin state government to start developing new teacher training materials on the State of Israel. These are all steps, but they can make a difference.
It's sort of a tragic irony that the solution that was seen for anti-Semitism, which was the creation of the State of Israel, has become, the primary instrument, if you will, of anti-Semitism. It's tragic, and I think the enemy knows that, and they're relentless in terms of using it. Now, when I hear about education, I don't know, it's just sort of, I hear it all the time. It's all about education, education, education. Does it really make a difference? And what kind of education are we talking about here? Just going into the schools and reminding them that we lost 6 million people, and therefore we deserve some empathy, or that they shouldn't listen to all the criticism that's unfair about Israel? I mean, what can you say to an average student in Germany that will mitigate against this anti-Semitic, wind, if you will?
David, that's an extremely important question. And as you can imagine, there's huge debates in educational circles about that at the moment. What can be done to really help students be less anti-Semitic? There's a school of thought that I don't agree with that says Muslims are discriminated against and they're victims, and first we have to deal with issues of racism, and then maybe we can start discussing issues of anti-Semitism. There is an enormous amount of discrimination, and we as Jews have always been the first to stand up for civil rights, and we have a lot of outreach to Muslim groups and particularly Turkish groups in Germany as AJC Berlin. I think that's important. But anti-Semitism needs to be labeled as such. We can't equivocate. And I think the important way to reach out to these young people is to help them understand that they're part of a democratic system, that they have a voice, they have a responsibility as young Germans, and to show them ways to exercise that voice, to engage in dialogue, to see different perspectives, and to reach in particular those young people who want to be part of the system. We're not going to reach all of them, let's be honest. But I think the important thing is to increase the number of those that we can have as partners to fight against anti-Semitism. One sign of encouragement, you want some positive news, is that we had in the last, following the terrible shootings in Paris, the murder of Jews at the supermarket, the murder of journalists, some of whom were also Jewish, at Charlie Hebdo, the head of the Central Council of Muslims in Germany made an appointment to come see us and reached out to us to say, what can we do to work with you to fight anti-Semitism? These are new tones. This didn't used to happen. We had the head of the Alevite community, a lot of the Turkish or Alevites, coming to us and saying, what can we do to help you fight anti-Semitism? And we had very moving experience. The Kurds, as we know, are working a lot with Israel. And their Peshmerga is being trained by IDF. And there's a large Kurdish community and Yazidi community in Germany. The Yazidis outside of Iraq have the largest group in Germany. We had a large delegation in December visit our offices to condemn anti-Semitism and to find ways to work together as minorities against it. There is good news out there.
Okay, so let's talk about the Jewish community in Germany. We always know the stereotype that Jews are more successful than average. I assume is that accurate in Germany as well?
It's more complicated because most of them came from the former Soviet Union. They were professionals who didn't have the necessary certification. So there's actually quite a large number of unemployed Jews, but they're all professionals.
Right, but I'm trying to get at this idea, is there any resentment? Because, and I'm trying to stay away from stereotypes, but I can't.
Yeah, is there resentment?
There's resentment, right? And then do you end up with a cognitive dissonance? For example, the idea of fighting anti-Semitism is an idea based on victimhood, right? We are victims of aggression, which is anti-Semitism, and at the same time, we are sort of the professionals and relatively successful. And does that create a certain cognitive dissonance that hurts your efforts?
You touched on some really important anti-Semitic stereotypes, which is that Jews exploit the Holocaust for their own gains,
right.
that Jews are looking for profit out of certain...
And they're still there.
They're still there. They're still strong. And if you measure anti-Semitic attitudes, unfortunately, those are very prevalent stereotypes.
And because they're there, when somebody hears you trying to be a victim, if you will, anti-Semitism, it seems like it could undermine those efforts.
Yeah, it's a dichotomy, and I think you're right. It depends who you're talking to, who are your partners, but those resentments do compete against this idea, this notion that Jews are victims. And one of the problems we have, to come back to education, is what we call competing narratives that are sort of a competition of victims.
Right.
And we have these young, I mean, there are schools in Germany where 80 to 90% of the kids come from someplace outside of Germany.
Right.
And they're sitting there and they're hearing about the Holocaust, but they're not processing it because what they're thinking is, well, we suffered in Palestine, we suffered in Algeria, we suffered in Bosnia, and they're not listening.
Right.
So teaching is one thing, but what children learn and what they understand is another.
Right. It's sort of the risk you run when you fight anti-Semitism is you sort of feed in. Okay, no, I wasn't sure I wanted to say that. So okay.
Well,
got it.
if I can,
Oh, I thought I did.
David, if I could just add, I think what's important also is that, as you say, children should not learn about Jews just as victims.
Right.
You know, to a large extent, they learn about the Holocaust, maybe the Crusades, and that's what they know about Jews. Jews are dead and they're victims. Jews are alive. We're here. And it's very important for Germany to start bringing into the curriculum much more about Jews as part of the course of German history, about Jewish life, culture today, and about modern Israel.
I was just going there because we have this thing in America called pro-Semitism,
Yeah.
where it's the only country in human history where it's actually cool to be Jewish. It's never happened before. When I tell my cousins in France that it's cool to be Jewish, they don't get it. But it's a unique phenomenon, and I know a lot of my Ashkenazi friends hate hearing that because it's not alarmism, and nobody's going to come to get you, and so forth. And there's really now some of it has been due to sort of the cultural aspect, which is we had the all the great comedians mid-century were Jews. We made America laugh for decades. When you make people laugh, you create a real sort of strong emotional bond. And there's been such a melding of the two cultures, the Jewish culture and the American culture. It gets to the point where you can't even distinguish between one or the other, to the point that you can make a case that America's become virtually a Jewish country, and where Hollywood speaks Yiddish all day long, and so forth. So the Jewish influence has been endemic, and I say this in a positive way. So, are there any Seinfelds and Billy Crystals, and are there any great Jewish characters in Germany that appeal to the mass audience, that make Germany laugh, that entertain Germany? Any Jon Stewarts? Any Steven Spielbergs?
No.
No. Maybe that should be your next project.
You know, there was a great entertainer after World War II, Hans Rosenthal, who unfortunately died fairly young. I mean, there have been a few, but let's remember, who was the Jewish community in Germany after World War II? There were maybe 15 to 20,000 Jews who, quite a few came through displaced person camps and left again, most left again, and there was only this core small group, many of whom knew German from growing up in what's today parts of Poland, but didn't even grow up in Germany. We're talking about a very small number of people, most of whom felt highly conflicted, Holocaust survivors. There was the image of sitting on packed suitcases, which is still pretty strong.
We've got to ship you some comedians then.
Yeah. So now
Because,
we have an influx, but then the Russian Jewish immigration started around 1990. And this is when Germany saw its chance to relaunch Jewish life in Germany. And to their credit, they opened the immigration gates, and we now have about more than 200,000 Jews. And among the younger ones, yes, they're not household names, but Vladimir Kaminer, who's known for staging wild parties and being a humorist and writes books, and he's pretty well known.
Keep an eye on him.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at it on the other side, you look at France, a huge part of the anti-Semitic wind is Dieudonné. You know, it's really funny and very, very popular guy. And he's just been lethal against the Jews.
Yeah.
You know, he started that whole, hand thing and so forth.
Cornell.
And what's crazy is that the laws are all against him. You know, they got a ruling against him today. You know, he got fined for 200,000 euros or something. So the laws are all on the side of the Jews, and still the effect is lethal. There's a French comedian that I know very well, Gad Elmaleh, but he won't come out and sort of defend the Jews, and that's unfortunate. So, look, I don't want to hog the whole time. I want to leave it. I can tell that this is an audience that would like to ask a few questions. So why don't we start with row number one?
And will you repeat the question?
Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
repeat the question.
Deidre, politics as it generally is practiced around the world is the first rule is get reelected. And Muslim population continues to grow. It's not shrinking in Europe. To what extent are the political leaders beginning to practice appeasement because politically the Muslim population is growing and is becoming more important?
Okay,
I
the
wish I would have asked that question.
The question is about the degree to which there's appeasement to Muslim voters. There's good news and bad news with the Muslim voters. First of all, I'm not entirely sure about the degree to which they're growing. I know here in the States you get bombarded with emails and email blasts and the dangers of, with these charts all worked out about how by 2030 Europe will be completely overrun by Muslims. The good news on this point is the minute people start working and become more middle class, the population growth is just like the population at large. So I'm a little skeptical about this sort of alarmism. Of course there's a danger, and already there are certain cities in Europe where there's a significant Muslim vote. The opportunity is that if we reach these people and they have a voice, that they exercise it responsibly as Democrats. It doesn't need to be negative against the Jews. And we shouldn't assume that just because more Europeans of Muslim faith or of Arab descent are coming into positions of power, that they'll necessarily be anti-Semitic. But this will happen if we don't work to make sure that they're more integrated into society. And one positive, because I want to keep giving you a few positive notes here, in Berlin, there were 3 candidates for mayor. One of the ones who didn't win was Raed Saleh. He's a young man in his late 30s, I think, Palestinian descent, a German. And of the 3 candidates for mayor, he was the one who spoke out the most against anti-Semitism. And in fact, I was on a panel with him, and this was really moving for me. There was someone else on the panel who works on educational programs against anti-Semitism, the Kreuzberg Initiative Against Anti-Semitism. And he started going on and on about how the Muslims are victims of discrimination, and this is what we have to deal with, and we can't really get to the anti-Semitism until... And he said, sorry, stop. There's a problem with anti-Semitism. Let's deal with this first. There's problems with discrimination. There's problems of hostility to Muslims. Deal with that as well. But let's not commingle these 2 problems. And he's of Palestinian descent. So it doesn't only have to be negative, even if there's a danger.
I want to jump in with a question. In France, one of the things we've been hearing, I've been interviewing people in France, is if you're wearing a yarmulke or if you don't, it makes a huge difference. So if you walk to synagogue on Shabbat wearing a yarmulke, you're a lot more likely to be afraid and to be careful and so forth. But if you're a secular Jew who doesn't go to synagogue, you're not as afraid, you're not as likely to leave and so forth. Are you seeing that? Are people afraid to wear a yarmulke in Berlin when they go to synagogue?
In some cases, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think we discuss it a lot. And I know just somebody at my office, Leonard says 5 years ago he didn't think about it, and now he does think about it, and he doesn't always wear one. So yes, it's had an impact even at that level.
Okay. All the way to the back.
I have a couple of questions.
Could you
Oh, no,
stand
just
up
one.
maybe? Just
Okay. All right, then I'll ask the most important one.
ask the most important one.
It's great that you talk about education. I commend you, but that rate is a turtle, and social media goes like this. I really believe that to fight anti-Semitism nationally, internationally, the Jewish community has to get together with all the other groups. We have brilliant people in PR, advertising. They need a plan. We need to go. I mean, this is great. I really commend you, but it's too slow. It doesn't work anymore. Where Muslims were being converted into radicalization, in prisons, which took years, like you're saying, it's happening in a couple of weeks. There has to be a reaction. And I think social media, and I think that combining this group along with AIPAC, along with the Israel Project, everyone getting together, because there's so many groups. And I think the work you're doing is great, but I'm afraid. I have children, I'm afraid for their future.
Yeah.
And I would like everyone to get together and move more quickly.
Okay, finally, a speech from the audience. It took us a while. Usually it happens quicker. Question? Go ahead.
I'll comment in a minute.
Oh, it wasn't a question.
First of all,
It's okay. I can make a brief comment. But.
first of all, is anti-Semitism and anti-Israel the same thing? And second, to the extent that there's anti-Israeli feelings that pervade Europe, neither of you talked about the perception, and I'm talking about just the perception of Israeli politics and its effect on Israeli feelings.
Well, I tried to address it earlier. I spent a lot of time on that subject. I think we'd love to make that distinction. We'd like to say, well, anti-Israel is not the same thing as anti-Semitism. But the reality is, as somebody who spent most of his life in communication, a lot of people don't make that distinction. So, like I was saying earlier, if there are 100 demonstrations in a city and 99 of them are against Israel, and I don't care what language they use, it's going to come across as anti-Semitism. But I stopped you from answering the previous thing,
previous
so I want
question.
to give you a chance. Forgive
Okay.
me. Go ahead.
Just briefly, social media is a medium and not a message. So the question is, what's the message? Indeed, the radicalization is going on very quickly. I don't believe there is one solution or one message that we have to counter it. And people, because I work a lot with people who work on education, it is slow, but I'm afraid there is no quick solution. And there's no quick way to reverse the sliding image of Israel. And this is a lot of what's at the heart of what we're talking about. If there were, I think we would have done it. You're right. We have a lot of very smart people. APEC and Stand With Us, and there's lots of organizations. We all have different ways of doing it, and I think that's good. That's why there are lots of organizations. And I think that we need to use social media much more to get out our message. This is true, and AJC has really made a big switch this past year.
Well, I'll just jump in on this one, because I think she does make a good point as well, that sometimes in the world of communication, you have sort of a step-by-step process, and sometimes you need that initial soundbite to sort of get them into the sequence of the message you want to give them. And I think what we've seen with the sort of for lack of a better word, the enemy, especially with the BDS movement and so forth, they really have that soundbite.
Yeah.
And that soundbite really helps spread, throughout social media, whether it's, Israel is an apartheid state, for example, and they've really used that successfully. So I sort of agree with both of you. It depends on what the message is, but I think we need to do a better job of coming up with these killer counter soundbites. I've been writing recently about, going on campuses, and the reality is that Israel is a beacon of hope in the Middle East. It really is. So that's an example of a soundbite that gets people's attention, and then you get them into the house and you show them around. Go ahead.
I was born in Istanbul, but I grew up in Europe, primarily in Heidelberg. So I see anti-Semitism as an element.
You guys speak up.
Maybe stand up.
Anti-Semitism as an element that is embedded in the European fabric, where you go to Greece or Italy or Spain. There's always has been a level of anti-Semitism, and most of the time it kind of peaks, and during economic hardships, pre-World War II Germany is a good example. And right now, as we look at Europe, with the exception of Germany, it's still in crisis, and France has a lot of problems, so is Spain. Germany is doing well, and UK is coming out slightly. So how do you see the correlation?
But between the correlation between the economic
What
situation
we're seeing as the peak of anti-Semitism
and the economic crisis.
Anti-Israel, anti-Jew, or you see the economic factor in it?
I don't see the economic factor, frankly, as really having played much of a role. It encouraged in Greece, I think, the birth, unfortunately, of the Golden Dawn, or at least the popularity. Hungary was not an issue of economics. And I don't think a lot of the populism of the moment is directly related. It has more to do with fears of this rapid spread of the European Union, of people having the feeling they don't have control over their lives. Where there is a big problem is in Southeast Europe. The economic crisis continues in Greece and Spain and Portugal. And there has been a spike there in anti-Semitism, but I think it's only one of many factors, I have to be honest. Some is the Mid-East conflict. Some of it is social media, the spread of conspiracy theories, which is intense at the moment. And I think that it's many fronts at once. It's not an easy solution.
Do you think as time goes on, like you were asking earlier, as radical Islam spreads throughout Europe, which it looks like it is spreading, and as the numbers spread, is it possible that they'll see a backlash where there'll be less anti-Semitism because now, you know, there's like different types of bad guys that we should hate?
If people start hating the Muslims more than
I mean, if
the
they feel
Jews?
if they feel so threatened, if the threat of radical Islam really spreads throughout Europe, you know, how does anti-Semitism
It's a good question.
fit into that?
Yeah. There's been, for instance, in Germany, there was this suddenly comet-like rise of this group called Pegida in Dresden. It's basically an anti-Muslim movement where people started going out on the street to protest Muslims. In the city, there are almost no Muslims in East Germany. It didn't stop them for a moment. These are people dissatisfied a little bit with their economic situation in this case, where they feel like they're the losers and they're looking for something to hate. So at I've been in several cities right now, someone asked me, so shouldn't we like Pegida because they're anti-Muslim? I said, not for a second. These guys are racists. They're xenophobes. And that's not, of course there's anti-Semitism on the margins of this movement. At the moment it's not open, but it doesn't help to be in alliance with those who hate.
Right, that's good. Good answer. Go ahead.
Deidre, in your opening remarks, you mentioned, or you suggested that if Jews flee Europe, or was it Germany? I'm not sure whether you said one or both. It would be a disaster, to paraphrase you, for Europe or Germany. Could you elaborate on why, given the fact that the percentage of Jews in Europe, particularly in Germany, is so small? Why should it make such a difference?
Yeah. The question is, why should it make a difference if Jews leave Europe? Europe was morally devastated after World War II. Not only had the Nazis murdered the Jews, they had a lot of help from a lot of countries. And I think that we can, with some justification, say that the strength of post-World War II democracy in Europe rests on the notion that Europe recognized and acknowledged what it had done to the Jewish people, and that it could create secure environments for Jewish life for those few who were still there and wanted to be there. In addition, Jews have made such a major contribution to Europe as it is today, to Western values, I mean, they're Judeo-Christian values, that the very notion that now, 70 years after World War II, that it's not safe in Europe for Jews to live, really puts, for me, a big question mark around democracy in Europe after World War II. If they are not capable of creating security for the Jewish community, then what's their understanding of minority rights and civil rights? This is really a litmus test for democracy in Europe.
Deirdre, here in LA, those of us who work with the diplomatic corps here in LA and have close relationships with them, we hear a lot of support for Jewish communities in their countries, and we hear them disavowing the anti-Semitism, the Hungarian Consul General, the German Consul General, the ambassadors who come here. Are they typical of the political leaders in country, and do their comments carry weight with the general public, and should they be speaking out stronger, or is it just the real trained, educated, cosmopolitan diplomat in Los Angeles who articulates those?
Yeah. The question here is about the consul generals, who are often very good about condemning anti-Semitism and saying it's not really a problem, and how representative is that? Goes a little bit back to the question we were just discussing. it's so important to them to come out against anti-Semitism because they know that to some extent the moral legitimacy of their country rests on the degree to which they can fight anti-Semitism. And a country like Hungary, let me say this about claims of the Hungarian Consul General that everything is safe in Hungary. I was talking recently to the head of the Lauder Foundation in Berlin, who's frequently in Budapest. And he said, the city in Europe where it's most difficult for him to wear a yarmulke and where he's basically given up is Budapest. He said there's no country where he's been spat at more and insulted more than walking the streets of Budapest. You can tell that to the Consul General.
Well, I mean, I don't know that they say it's safe, but they condemn it. I mean, they're very
Right.
Yeah, of
well, I
course.
think that's part of the tragedy.
condemning it. So
Because
are they
you have
doing that
laws that
in-
defend the Jews.
Right, but are they doing that in their own countries and
Yeah,
There's no
they,
doubt.
and do
they
people
do.
listen to them and
No
follow
doubt.
them,
You
or-
hear all the time. You hear the prime ministers and the president, the leaders in France, in Germany. It's a constant defending. You know, you can go to jail for 5 years in Germany just to deny the Holocaust, right?
But it's pretty hard to prove.
Yeah, and
unfortunately.
there's so many laws. You see, but what I find really tragic is you have support from the government, but you can't legislate, you know, decency and fairness.
There's often a gap between what the public opinion leaders say and the diplomats and the public at large.
To tag on to that, we had the French consulate at our synagogue. We had a panel talking about anti-Semitism, and he basically said the same thing that you're saying, that there's these laws and the government is, you know, very supportive of the Jews. But when you talk to the Jewish leaders in Paris, they will say to you, yeah, that's all great, but
Right.
nobody's enforcing the laws. The police are not enforcing them.
They're very, very
Why?
hard. Go ahead.
Why? I think it's very difficult sometimes to determine what's anti-Semitism, although a lot of these, the aggressiveness on the streets of Paris, I think the police were afraid in a lot of cases. There was an enormous amount of aggression this past year. And I think that there's not always the necessary sensitivity. I think France is waking up. I will say this. I think that they've taken a number of steps in recent weeks. Maybe it took, sadly, the incident of Charlie Hebdo for them to understand that it's not just the Jews. The Jews are the first to be attacked. But this is really an attack against Western civilization, which is also part of the answer to the question as to why would Europe be different.
Is it the same problem in Germany? Is it that they're also not showing, the police just aren't showing up?
In Germany, we believe strongly that there needs to be a lot more education among law enforcement authorities as to what's anti-Semitism, as to the seriousness of it. I think one of the problems is there's no common definition, and attempts, AJC had a lot to do with initiating a so-called EU-wide working definition of anti-Semitism that's used commonly by NGOs throughout Europe now. Governments are very reluctant to use it because it clearly says that exaggerated criticism of Israel can be anti-Semitic, and they don't want to get close to it. So we found in Germany this summer, for instance, that the police didn't intervene under the name of free speech at points where we thought it was important to intervene. And I think they're now a little more sensitive to it, but they are a little more sensitive is very, you know, is a big statement. I think there were discussions in many German cities about the degree to which the police didn't take action when they should have. But will this translate into more training in their academies? We don't know yet. We're working on it because it's a very important point. Could you get Ruth Block on there? Ruth, yeah.
Ruth.
Yeah. Okay, the question is, if we, in the education system, if we get out to the smaller communities. Yeah.
When the Holocaust is taught in schools, is it as a separate subject, which I think links to victims, or is it taught as part of German history?
Yeah.
Is what I think should be done.
Right, as you should. Okay, the question is, does education reach into the more rural areas and the degree to which Holocaust is taught as part of German history or simply as a separate subject? Germany is, as such, Ruth, as we know, a pretty decentralized country. Berlin is the big city with 3.5 million in a country of 80 million. So it tends to be more rural in that sense than the United States. There's not quite the big urban centers. But the further afield you go, as we know, the less sophisticated sometimes the education. Not that everything's perfect in big cities, but I think you're right. In more rural areas, there's a lot less that's taught, and there's almost no Jews, if any. Holocaust education is often taught as a separate subject. There's sort of, you learn about the Nazis, and then there's the unit about the Holocaust. And I think, and we've talked about it a lot, it's very important that more be taught about Jews as part of German history and not just the Holocaust. I think you're right, and I think it's a message that needs to be repeated again and again.
Go ahead.
It seems to me that we need to look at the common thread of all the groups, and the underlying thread is hate. Self-hate, hate of others. To what extent is there an attempt to move away from intellectual definitions like anti-Semitism and more attempts to kind of unite all of them or try to educate rather than put the lid on them, laws and education, intellectual education, to bring everybody together to maybe get some insight into whatever fuels all this?
Yeah. Well, there are, I mean, for instance, in Berlin, there's a Center for Research on Anti-Semitism. There are experts who work on issues of what fuels anti-Semitism. But again, to really, to deal with those issues, you're back at education. Because how can you reach people if you don't think about what are the best ways to reach young people? What are the best approaches, whether it's in school or out of school? But these are matters of education, public awareness campaigns.
Yeah, I think she's talking about something a little different, which is not just education, but more inspiration. Exactly. Something that's a little more emotional.
Right.
Then education could be seen as a dry thing, and we're trying to get to the core issue that people hate. Right. And hate is an emotional idea, and can inspiration play a role in education?
Well, who does the inspiring? I mean, there are groups who are trying to inspire, to set the tone, so to speak, and create more public awareness. But it's how to counter hate, and we really don't know. It's the problem. We have to keep trying.
Go ahead.
You mentioned that recently some different Muslim groups had approached you in AJC at the Berlin office. Can you give us some examples of what initiatives or what results came out of those meetings? What has AJC done with the different Muslim groups?
Well, this has been a very new... The question is, what have we done with the Muslim groups who have reached out to us in terms of fighting anti-Semitism? We're putting together a network of groups to fight anti-Semitism, and what we're going to do is integrate them into these groups so that they're not singled out, and that they're part of a larger fabric of society working together on these issues. This is something very important. We work with the educational efforts we have. We're developing programs to counter anti-Semitism. There are educators who themselves are of Turkish or Arab background, and we bring them into the quotient. And we will work with these groups to hopefully have them use this material within their communities when we prepare it. When we finish it.
You've been at this 30 years.
15 years. I was a journalist for 15 years.
Okay, 15. That's pretty good. When you look back on 15 years, I mean, and you're probably involved with hundreds of initiatives. Is there one or two that stand out where you say, wow, that was really made a difference, like more than others? Is there anything that stands out in your mind that surprised you in terms of its effectiveness?
I think there is no magic solution to fighting anti-Semitism, and I'm sorry not to be more specific, but it depends on what group of kids you're talking to or young people. And that alone there's so many variables there that it's very hard to say. I think what does work and what's important is to connect with young people, to find that factor that brings them in.
But is there an event that you organized or some kind of initiative that you recall that said, wow, or is it just...
Yeah, no, AJC here in Los Angeles in 1980 was responsible for creating a program called Hands Across the Campus, which is a core values curriculum program that was used at the time in schools. There was a lot of tension in schools to try and get to create more leadership and to create more ownership among groups, to help them better understand who am I, who are you, my neighbor, and what can we do together to change things. And this formula, if you want to bring it down to one thing, is what I think works the best, is to create more self-awareness among young people about who they are, what their own identity is, who's the neighbor, to create more empathy, sympathy about changing perspectives, and then to get them to the step of working together to fight anti-Semitism or to work on other issues. And we've had some very moving initiatives that have come out of, we've worked in Germany to adapt this material for German schoolrooms. And in fact, we created one called Hands for Kids for elementary school groups. And if you want one moment that I think is moving is to see a group of second graders sitting on the floor holding a class console and working on taking a protocol. And somebody says, well, at the courtyard, in the playground, somebody knocked me over. And the other person says, well, why did they do that? And they start seriously discussing this issue. And I thought, in an atmosphere like that, this gives these kids the mechanism to start understanding conflict and discuss conflict. It's not an immediate antidote to anti-Semitism, but it gives them the tools that we need in a democratic society to lessen hate.
You're going to the root. Hands Across Campus. Maybe you ought to bring it back.
Yeah.
We need it. How many more questions?
Let's take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's it.
Wow. Okay. Man, I got a red eye to catch.
12 minutes, so as long as...
Maybe everybody just asks the question and we summarize.
Let's start on this side and run this direction.
Do you feel the role of the German government has changed in the past year in response to some of these events? If so, how? That may be too broad to cover in 12 minutes, but also, what is your hope in terms of future responses on the part of the government that you think might be helpful?
I can do that quickly. The government's response has not changed significantly. They have allotted more money and more funds to programs combating anti-Semitism, but they don't know what to do with it because nobody understands how to fight anti-Semitism. I think what would be helpful is if they, not only in Germany, but as France has just done, appoint a commissioner for affairs on anti-Semitism. Most of these governments in Europe don't know, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, the ministries are not communicating with each other, and even if they've started initiatives, there's no coordination at all. So I think, number one, the governments need to have point people, and number two, the parliaments need to have task forces within the parliament, working groups, and there needs to be much more serious discussion about how to lessen levels of anti-Semitism in society.
What is AJC doing about encouraging German local or national governments to do what the cities of Vienna and Krakow have been doing, which is point out that in Germany, until the Second World War, most significant cultural people, more significant than Jerry Seinfeld and his people in this matter, were Jews. The musicians, the poets, the painters, the authors, they were all Jews, and German society used to be very much influenced by Jews. Why don't you talk about what AJC is doing to bring that up like they do, as I said, in Vienna and in Krakow?
Well, I'm not sure how effectively they do that in Vienna, but this goes back to what Ruth Block was saying. We agree that, and this is something we bring up in educational circles a lot, the importance of focusing on Jews as part of German Jewish history. One of the there's things we do that we don't talk a lot about. Like, for instance, there was a resolution in Parliament in June 2013 that recommended this. This came from us, basically. We helped draft some of this language that ends up, we hope that it will have an impact.
If the person
Go ahead.
who made this comment will accept an amendment to his comment, history is great. And he made that comment very clearly. But what is now, and what is the future, and what is the role of Jews in a positive way in Germany, in Prague, in Krakow?
I think it's that positive aspect of who we are as Jews in Europe that needs to be brought.
Yeah, the question of the positive aspect of who we are as Jews in Europe and how can that be brought out?
Pro-Semitism. Yeah, why don't we get all the questions, and then we'll wrap them up. Go ahead.
In the last week, Netanyahu has said that there won't be a two-state solution. He said that you better rush out to the polls because the Arabs are voting in high numbers. How is that affecting the attitudes in Germany?
Not good.
There were two more, I think.
Go ahead.
The question is, there seems to be an identification substantially with Israel and a relationship with anti-Semitism because whatever Israel does is the Jew do. Is there a program like Israeli Expo, for example, that would the government of Israel and manufacturers and agricultural and salinization events where a fair is put on where the government of Israel says, here's what we're doing in your country.
Okay. And I think
there's a program in Germany called Hayek. Are you familiar with it? The budget is it being successful? It's a de-radicalization program.
Oh, what's it called?
HAYAT. It's sponsored by the German government, and they identify foreign fighters who are being radicalized on their way to go. Either stop them through a de-radicalization program, or upon return, identify them rather than prosecute them. They put them through a de-radicalization program. I wanted to see if you don't know anything about it, you can't talk about it, but is it being successful? The budget, it's the first of its kind in Europe, if you can elaborate.
Okay, I'll summarize 4 questions. One was a comment on the importance of promoting the positive aspect of Jewish influence on society in the present. 2 was what has been the reaction to Prime Minister Netanyahu's negative comments a few days ago regarding the Palestinian state and blah, 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 and the Arabs and so forth, and how has it been? And the third one was, does Israel itself do any positive activities in Germany to fight anti-Semitism, like showing off some of its good stuff? And then the last question was Hayat on this German program that tries to find out who the bad guys are that leave and go fight bad wars.
Yeah. Okay, positive identity. Not so easy at a time when security for Jewish institutions is being ratcheted up with good reason. It's very difficult to be more out there and more in public when everything has to take place with armed guards and not as openly as it did before. Of course it's important. I think in Germany there has been a much more open display of being Jewish and who am I, because there's been a huge growth in the community in the last 25 years, which creates a more self-confident community and more of a public presence. The Jews from the former Soviet Union also have a different attitude than some of the other Jewish communities. They say, hey, we decided to come to Germany, our families, in the last 25 years. We made a conscious decision. This is where we want to live. And we came here because of anti-Semitism in the former Soviet Union. We're not going to let a little anti-Semitism decide to uproot us and then move on elsewhere. We're here to stay. So I think there is there's that aspect of being affirmative and being more self-confident. There was just a wonderful event 2 weekends ago, 1,000 young German Jewish children between 10 and 19 who put on a yearly event called Eurovision, which is a song contest among 18 different Jewish student groups. And this year it was Tikkun Olam was the message. And they all wrote songs sort of revolving around this concept. And it was inspiring, to come back to what's inspiring. It was inspiring to see all these young kids saying, here we are, and we're pleading for more interfaith dialogue. We're pleading, we say, acknowledge anti-Semitism, but here we are. And I think that's one image I can maybe give you, that there are some positive things going on. Bibi Netanyahu in his comments. Well, today he already backtracked. Let's hope he keeps backtracking. It isn't easy. He's not popular in Europe, and he will continue to not be popular in Europe. But Israel, we need nonetheless to underline the importance of the relationship. Germany is key for Israel and Europe. and to get to the Israeli Expo. There's an unbelievable dense network of relations between Germany and Israel that isn't always apparent on an economic level, on a cultural level, on an academic level. And yes, there's a lot that goes on in Germany in terms of Israel showing what it can do, or of Germans from the top level of government on down going, and there's more and more exchange, in fact. So while there's a public opinion is sliding, there's also more young people who visit Israel, and it's not quite as desperate a situation as I might have made it seem. The foreign fighters. I'm not familiar with this one particular program, but I'm familiar in general with the efforts of the German government. Tuesday, when I get off the plane, I'm going directly to a conference that we've co-organized with the Adenauer Foundation on exactly the issue of foreign fighters and de-radicalization. I don't know how far developed this program is yet. I know some of the people working in this area. I think Germany is taking it very seriously, and I think there may be lessons to be learned, but frankly, this is all very new, and I don't think that we're quite there yet. But we're following it closely, and we're providing a platform so that the experts can exchange with one another on this issue.
Thank you very much, Deirdre.
Thank you all.